Welcome to Integral Talks, a podcast series brought to you by Integral Advisors, where we dive into the world of compliance, risk management, and due diligence, and provide you with expert insight and analysis to help you make more informed business decisions.
Hello and welcome back to our podcast. I'm your host, Alberto de la Portilla. As always, thank you for tuning in to Integral Talks. 2 weeks ago, TD Bank and its parent TD Bank US Holding pleaded guilty to violations of money laundering following an extensive investigation by the Department of Justice. Systemic failures of controls at the bank permitted illicit funds to the tune of many hundreds of millions of dollars from drug cartels to pass through the institution undetected and or unreported. TD is the largest bank in U.S. history to plead guilty to compliance program failures. They were hit with total penalties of $3.1 billion, the largest in history ever imposed under the Bank Secrecy Act. What happened? How did a bank this high profile have such severe lapses in anti-money laundering compliance and basic control systems established to detect and report suspicious activity? What lessons can we learn from this? Are there any indicators as to current trends in financial crimes in the TD case, or was a TD case an outlier? We'll discuss this with our guest today. Scott Moritz is president of White Collar Forensic, a boutique investigative forensic accounting and compliance advisory firm based in New York. From 1986 to 1996, Scott served as a special agent for the FBI. During his tenure, he focused primarily on white-collar crime, public corruption, and money laundering investigations throughout the U.S. and internationally. Scott's vast experience includes working cases involving fraud, embezzlement, bribery, kickbacks, organized crime, criminal money laundering, and boiler room operations. He is a subject matter expert in corporate governance, internal investigations, and forensic accounting and regulatory compliance. Welcome to the podcast, Scott.
Oh, thanks for having me, Alberto. I'm excited for this discussion.
So let's talk about TD. Big news, right, in our industry. 2 weeks ago, this is announced. One of the things that DOJ pointed out was that it was clear that the bank failed to appropriately fund and staff the program. And one of the phrases that I saw throughout that consent order was this concept of flat cost paradigm. Sort of maintaining your costs flat while the bank is growing and revenues and profits are growing. Can you talk about the importance of ensuring that financial institutions from top to bottom invest in compliance, continue to invest in compliance, and also in the controls and systems of the institution?
Absolutely. Listen, I think they're probably going to do away with the euphemism flat cost paradigm going forward. But, it's obviously for any compliance program, and particularly in a regulated industry like a financial services company, you have to have sufficient resources and headcount. I would submit to you that TD Bank had plenty of headcount and plenty of resources. They just weren't being applied well. I want to say that at some point there was, I think in 2019, even though they don't publish their head count, there was an interview of one of the more senior, the senior most anti-money laundering person at TD Bank at the time, and he said that he had 9 direct reports and total head count of 775 people. That is 2x the head count of FinCEN. And so, it's not a matter of not having sufficient resources. It's how they were deployed, and the design of their system, and I think also the fact that there were pretty significant gaps in their system that just were persistently not being addressed year over year. And I think that that's a big issue, because you can have a whole bunch of bodies, but if they're not being used efficiently, you're not going to execute very well on the mission.
Right. I mean, when you take a look at that consent order, I think it was like 100 pages. I was reading it again last night. There's so much there of just basic common sense that was not applied. And one of the things, one of the comments also was that TD was the bank of choice for many money laundering operations. And again, I mentioned it at the intro, hundreds of millions of dollars tied to fentanyl, narco trafficking, human trafficking, even terrorist financing. And so in our world, at least, I've always heard that, criminals tend to look for the path of least resistance, right? And here we are, one of the largest institutions in the United States, certainly in North America, being where the funds went. So, I think it's a misnomer to think that, criminals are going to go to the smaller banks necessarily, given this example.
Well, I think one of the unfortunate thing for TD Bank is, this isn't going to be yesterday's news anytime soon. This is a really illustrative example of the importance of robust anti-money laundering programs to law enforcement's mission. Because multiple criminal cases gave rise to this enforcement action. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's the regulatory exam process and
right.
an institution failure to remediate year over year these persistent findings on the part of regulatory exams cause an MOU to be put into place. But this one certainly seems to have been triggered by a law enforcement action, and it's really like a perfect storm from what I've read. I mean, first of all, one of the biggest criminal cases that gave rise to this was a Chinese money laundering operation. Money laundering, any revenue generating crime, that if the proceeds are then transacted, that's money laundering. And then there are criminal organizations that they have this side activity where they have to then try to legitimize or create the veneer of legitimacy to their proceeds. But then there's organizations that are set up to provide money laundering as a service to other criminal organizations. And that's what we're talking about in one of these instances. This Chinese company was laundering money for a fee, 1 to 2% of the money that are being transacted. And that criminal organization was bribing employees of the bank, which
right.
It's not something that you really, when you're architecting an anti-money laundering program, that's top of mind, is that, you're putting people in positions of trust, you're giving them duties and responsibilities, particularly people on the, on the first line. And if those people are being bribed, the whole thing falls apart very quickly.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think, they're gift cards. They were giving gift cards to the tellers, and I think, the tellers, the front line, right, are responsible for filing CTRs. I mean, I think that speaks also to just how critical it is to have this and invest in ongoing training. Training is one of the fundamental pillars of a sound AML compliance program, and here you have tellers and probably others. We don't know. I think the order has identified so far 5, but there are probably more employees. I'm suspecting that it will come out later that were involved, because it's such a massive fraud and such a massive case involving many years of activity. But gift cards being used to bribe tellers is something that so simple, and yet it was being accepted, and it's unfortunate. But I think training is, just again, this is why it's one of the pillars of a compliance program.
Without question. I mean, there's so much to unpack in this matter. I think one of the things that really jumped out at me is, listen, every major institution, particularly retail banks like TD Bank, they are heavily reliant on transaction monitoring as, kind of one of the things that is at the core of their program. But anti-money laundering systems are fed by the underlying transaction systems of the different products within an institution.
Right.
And it appears that TD made some wholesale decisions that were catastrophic, including they disabled or disregarded large cash transactions for all of their commercial customers. They disregarded ACH transactions across the board,
Right.
and they disregarded domestic Zelle payments across the board. Those are high risk, in this, in the scheme of things. You do a risk assessment of products. Cash transactions, very, very high risk.
Cash is king.
And electronic funds transfers, very, very high risk. And
Right.
just to make these, kind of wholesale decisions and for the hundreds of billions of dollars of being transacted in the institution on an annual basis that are just being disregarded. Is it any surprise that there was unreported suspicious activity?
Right. I agree. I mean, it's that's why I kind of keep coming back to this. There's so much blatant abuse and disregard for reporting requirements, and just sort of common sense practices. And I get. I mean, the whole. We talked a little bit earlier about these kind of bribes to employees, and so that sort of speaks to the culture of the bank. Code of conduct, ethics. Can you talk a little bit about what, not only financial institutions, but we're talking about TD. We can stick with that, or just corporations in general. Like what can they do? I know this is sort of a loaded question, to sort of ensure better kind of cooperation internally, loyalty, ethics, compliance with a sort of code of conduct that is in every handbook in every company in the world. Like what can banks and other types of corporations do to ensure that employees follow that?
Listen, at the risk of oversimplifying this, I think some organizations, in how they communicate and train on compliance, it begins and ends with the rules that you have to follow, without that broader context as to why. And I think, most, employees that are wired correctly, which is the overwhelming majority of employees, would say, I don't want to be a part of an organization that encourages criminals to gravitate to our institution. And if you kind of connect the dots for the employees that are on the front line in particular, that if we don't get this right, we're going to become an attractive institution to drug dealers and human traffickers and all manner of criminal. And by the way, it's going to be economically disastrous for the organization, and raises and bonuses aren't going to happen anytime in your lifetime. So that's a really good way of connecting the dots for them too. If you can't appeal to them on the basis of morality, maybe on the basis of their self-interest. Like, if we get this right, there will be more money available for raises and bonuses, and you'll have a career path. Because it sounds simple, but that's one of the best training introductions I ever sat in on. I was doing some anti-money laundering training at a financial institution, and the regional CEO got up and kicked off the training and said just that. I said, hey, we have all these compliance obligations. The cost of non-compliance is great. If we get this right, we will have more money to pay you. And it was like everybody sat up in their seat and paid really good attention. And, sometimes it's really, connecting those dots is such an important thing. And it's
Yeah.
so often it's overlooked.
Yeah, and it's interesting, but at the same time, and it's true, and context is important here. But at the same time, the devil's in the details. So like when you read the TD order, you read about how the BSA department, and particularly the senior compliance people, were being praised, rewarded. Perhaps their bonus was tied to this as well, in order to maintaining costs. Keep your costs flat. We're growing, and that was tied in with their compensation package, and they were praised for that. So clearly that's not the right incentive. We know of another client that we've worked with in the past where they would they would tie bonus and additional compensation to not just compliance, but sort of frontline, if they just follow the rules and the policy, and there were basic policy that they need to follow and to ensure that the bank is complying with the regulatory requirements, and that was effective. But that wasn't to the extent where they say, well, you can do this and keep your costs down, then we're going to reward you even more. TD was sort of doing that. So there's been some published reports about there've been many published reports about this case, but one of the things that I read recently was sort of, hey, let's take a look at the regulations. This is, are the regulations too complex? Are they too much of a burden on institutions? Do you think TD will lead to stricter oversight and governance on the part of, regulators? Do you see any kind of game-changing overhaul of AML compliance requirements as a result of what we're seeing at TD?
And listen, I
And I
think
know
it's
crystal balling, but yeah,
I think at some level, yeah, you have to look at the regulatory exams that leading up to
Right.
this matter,
Right.
just to see what did they miss something? Is it
Right.
simply a matter of TD not acting on the regulatory findings, year over year, or was it something fundamentally wrong with the regulatory exam process? I mean, certainly, listen, anti-money laundering for a major financial institution, particular research, a retail institution, you have 10 million customers. That is, a needle in a haystack, to the 100th power.
Right.
But there are tools and techniques, and there's tons of guidance on how to go about getting this right. There, but there's so many things that can be learned from this matter. Not every case is a teachable moment. This one has dozens of teachable
Countless.
moments, including, and I don't know if this is the case, and they certainly didn't publicize it, but the passage of AmLaw 2020 had a whistleblower provision. You
Right.
had a bunch of people who were saying this isn't right. We should be filing CTRs, or the CTRs we're filing aren't complete, and we're allowing huge amounts of cash to be deposited, and then we're issuing 40 or 50 debit cards per account when the
Right.
limit is supposed to be 10, and then there's a whole bunch of debit card activity in Colombia. I mean,
Same
that,
day transactions, and
yeah.
yeah.
And by the way, that's been a kind of standard, a part of the standard transaction monitoring, typology since 9/11.
Right.
Because there wasn't a lot of transactional behaviors to kind of glean from the 9/11 matter, but one of them was that.
Right.
And so that everybody has to have
Right.
their terrorist financing rule that kind of was informed by the 9/11 hijackers. So, I don't know what they were doing with there was a lot written about suspending changes to the AML tuning and scenarios as they kept going through these different iterations of transaction monitoring, retrofitting, throwing out the baby in the bathwater, new system. And I think the decision they made to stand up a new system in 2021, it still isn't live.
Right.
That, listen, it's not all about transaction monitoring, but it's a big part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder when you mentioned the AMLA 2020 Act and that whistleblower provision, which has now been strengthened by that law. But you're right. There is evidence, at least in the writing of the allegations and charges, of employees sending emails saying there's something not right here, and it being obviously ignored or whatever. And there's a lot of that in bold if you read through the consent order. And so I think we'll see. I'm just curious if how the regulators are going to look at this, because there are so many different, what you would think institutions have been able to overcome in terms of how do you manage these sort of these types of risk and so then I also, when I first had the idea of inviting you to the podcast, I wanted to talk about what's trending in financial crimes and economic crimes in the world today, and we'll get there. But then TD hits, and then this became the news of the day, this sort of giant thing that hit and kind of sent shockwaves across the industry. But when you look at, let's talk a little bit about what's trending in the world of economic crimes. Financial crimes are happening, but they're not necessarily consistent with what we saw at TD Bank. There are things that are much more complex, involving technology that the world has seen in the last 5 years, technological advancements such as AI, deep fake technology. Can you just talk a little bit about what you're seeing from your perspective in terms of what's trending, what people should be aware of vis-a-vis current financial crimes in the marketplace?
Certainly, these advances in technology, the accessibility of AI, like so many advances in technology, transnational crime organizations are always early adopters.
Sure.
of the latest technology.
Right.
You can go back to when the internet first became, sort of widely accessible to, regular consumers, and it wasn't just, academia and the military that was using it. The organized crime was all in right away. And I think that's true. They are, and then virtual currency, when it
Right.
first, it very quickly became the coin of the realm of transnational criminal organizations. Listen, cryptocurrency companies and exchanges will tell you that over time, cryptocurrency will actually be part of the solution, because of, it's different than cash, because cash, you can't really trace it. Whereas, on the blockchain, there is a permanent journal entry showing the exchange of cryptocurrency. But technology is always going to be an enabler to crime. And I think some of it is just using it as an allure to defraud people. So like pig butchering is, it's a new twist of an old scheme of romance fraud where these absolutely reprehensible human beings prey on people who are lonely. And some of the lonely people that they prey on are the elderly. So it's
The elderly.
it's doubly sickening in terms of the victim pool, and they pretend to be it's a little bit of a difference in the romance scheme than historical romance schemes, and I think it's a big reason why it's so successful. Is it starts out, where you get like a text message or a message on WhatsApp or some of the messaging apps and social media, and it's clearly somebody trying to reach someone else. And sorry, but then they continue the conversation. So this is an innocent, wrong party, but I'm so lonely, I'm going to talk to anybody, and
Right.
that's how like this first friendship and then romance, long distance romance is struck up, and the victim doesn't know obviously that the person has bad intent, and then there comes a point where they just just remark in conversation how much money they're making in crypto investments. And it's so simple. And there's this app that you can get from the App Store. And look at all the money I've made in a short period of time. And they, one of the sort of brilliant things in that scheme is they don't offer that person to invest. They're just talking about their success, and they make the person solicit from the fraudster, oh, well, how do I get involved? And then, well, it's not for everybody, but here's how you do it. And and then it's all. I mean, that's how they bait the hook. And you're talking about enabling technologies. One of the things that's amazing is this app, which you can get from the App Store on Apple, or all of the different where you get your Google apps and your smartphone. It's a real app, and it's got 5 stars, and yet all it is something that is used in a furtherance of the scheme to show earnings that are just false. And so that scheme is one of the most prevalent schemes targeting individuals, and I want to say losses are $75 billion to date.
Is that right? Okay.
And to the extent that law enforcement is able to even quantify it. And that $75 billion figure, it's higher than law enforcement because an academic institution kind of studied crypto transactions attributable to pig butchering and came up with a much larger number of 75 billion, whereas I think law enforcement estimates are a tenth of that. But that's certainly one scheme that's really prevalent.
Let's go. Crypto has this. There's a sort of narrative around crypto. Those that don't know crypto well, that crypto transactions are anonymous, and you referenced earlier that there is it's logged somewhere along the blockchain. Can you just kind of dispel some of the rumors around that anonymity? Because it's clear that there are a lot of cases we've seen in the last couple of years where and the Mexican cartel, Colombian cartel are part of the way that they're using to launder some of their funds is that they're using crypto, and so crypto becomes the headline, crypto, but it's just part of one of several different ways that they're laundering money. But can you talk a little bit about how that anonymity concept around crypto isn't what we think it is?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly more to go on. If somebody robs a bank and successfully gets away, which is the dumbest crime in the world, by the way, but it is, tracing the cash itself isn't very easy.
Right.
Now, the serial numbers of a subset of what was stolen from the bank they're called bait bills, and those serial numbers are written down somewhere, and so they're put into law enforcement databases as a way of trying to trace it. But if you think about just how cash is exchanged,
Yeah.
and it's the cashier at Target isn't checking the serial numbers of the $100 bill that I paid for my groceries with. So it's not a fail-safe system. Whereas crypto, there are IP addresses, and there are unique identifiers and ledgers on the blockchain that are immutable, meaning they cannot be changed, and they are permanent. And if somebody knows what they're doing and has the right tools, they can trace a crypto transaction out to as many hops as that cryptocurrency has taken. It's not easy because there are different blockchains, but it is achievable. And it is, listen, there will come a point where crypto becomes more and more of a mainstream means of value transfer because of it.
Yeah.
It's a traceable form of payment.
Yeah, yeah, and that, and then obviously not just. I mean, we're heading to a world where, I mean, there will always be people that want to have cash and hold cash, but I think there's another generation, and another generation behind them that it's going to be all digital, and all kind of transactions will be digital, and so that is going to lead to things that we don't know about. I mean, potential fraud and economic crimes. And there'll be other technologies. I know someone who is a CFO of a corporation, received an email from her boss asking, hey, we need to pay such and such company. The email was written, I'm sure you've heard this before, the email was written in the same sort of style and format and language and lingo that boss would use in normal conversation or normal past emails. So the CFO approved of a payment of, I don't know, $20,000, $30,000 to a company that does not exist. They had somehow obtained the information of that company, and then but the money went elsewhere. But if you read the email and you read past emails by the CEO, I mean, you would have a hard time denying that or doubting it. And it's because they've, artificial intelligence technology has found a way to just mirror to a T, right? How we talk, how we look, what we say. It's scary.
It's a brilliant scheme.
Yeah.
It, like so many brilliant schemes, it originated in West Africa. The people that brought you the
Really? Right.
419 fraud, where you used to get letters and then faxes and then emails from the widow of the Nigerian oil minister who wants
right.
to send you, they just you $500 million,
Right.
to deposit into your bank account,
Right.
and then all you have to do is send them $50,000 to pay their costs or whatever it is, and that for many years was the most prolific and successful and longest running fraud scheme going. It got to the point where everybody knew about it, so they had to diversify and enter, what they used to refer to as the fake president scheme. The law enforcement, of course, had to rename it into business email compromise. And the business email compromise is exactly what you just described. And it's being enhanced by AI, and it's also being enhanced by network intrusion methodologies, because it's a scheme that relies on social engineering, which is kind of analog, just tricking people into giving out information, but also much of it is reliant on recon that sometimes goes on behind a company's firewall. They gain access to the network, and one of the things that they harvest is the personnel lists job descriptions, and that then gives them some insight into who inside the company has wire transfer and ACH payment system entitlements.
Access.
And they target those people, and they're usually pretty junior. And so, how likely is it, for a very junior person in the treasury function or in the finance function to question the CEO who says, hey,
Right.
I'm entrusting you with this secret, M&A transaction that we have to do, and you can't tell anybody else. It's got to be just you and between you and me. Here is a routing number and a bank account number that I need you to send a series of wires to, and it's for this very sensitive top secret transaction, and people fall for it. They're still falling for it.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is if you're lucky, it's 20 grand, but I know of ones tens of millions of dollars went out the door, and until somebody, until it came across somebody's desk who looks at, bank statements and banking activity, and I think that the takeaway on this is never, execute a transaction on the basis of an email instruction alone, because it could be spoofed. And as uncomfortable as it may be to look up somebody's phone number, don't take the phone number off the email you received, look it up in the company director, or if they happen to be in the same office as you, go to their office and say, is this you? Did you send me this email?
Yeah.
Because and that, that's the thing that you just have to train people on, is because it's the most preventable crime, because there's a very finite number of people who have ACH and wire transfer authority, and if you train them, then this isn't going to be a problem.
Right.
There's a second version of this scheme, though, that is much more difficult to prevent, because what it does, it seeks to intercept outbound wires to satisfy invoices, so like vendor invoices.
Right.
And it usually consists of harvesting this information from the network. They correctly identify these vendor relationships, and then they contact somebody who they've, through social engineering and doing recon, are likely people responsible for the payment, for accounts payable, and then they say, hey, our bank account information has changed, and we neglected to include that on our most recent invoice. Can you make sure that next payment goes to this account and this account number? And that's, again, it's a control weakness that they're taking advantage of.
Sure.
Because people are, okay, sure, we know you're one of our biggest vendors.
Right.
And if you just lock down in the accounting electronic, enterprise resource planning system, the ability to change payment instructions without a supervisor signing off on it, that's another one that you'll prevent that from happening. But it happens all the time, and it's the some companies have lost more than $100 million to this scheme, in a couple of days.
Yeah.
It's crazy, and it's it's just people need to be aware, and as we sit here today, not everybody is aware.
No, and I think there are companies, I've heard of companies, obviously you have dual authentication protocols now, and you have even things like they use them as sort of keywords or safe words, that if an email goes to the if an email comes to the CFO from the CEO saying, make this payment, this vendor, I've known him for 20 years, blah, 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 and you respond by email, what's your code word, or asks you a question that only the two of you know, right? And then it's something, and I've heard of companies, smaller companies, that are doing that. They're creating these sort of safe words that It's not documented unless it's in an email. Now, once you put that in an email, that could be picked up, but then you got to change that, right? You got to change that code word. But yeah, there's so many different ways that technology is enabling bad actors to perpetrate these frauds. So we've been doing this podcast for about a year and a half now. We're actually almost out of time. So. And we're always talking about risk and compliance, but one of the things that I like to do is always finish on a lighter note, and ask my guest a question about something that's near and dear to my heart beyond, besides just risk and compliance, is music. So I wanted to, you're a New Yorker, so I want to talk about New York and New York musicians, and New York is, the history of musicians that have come out of New York is just, it's like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Ramones, the Madonna, Lou Reed, Miles Davis, Talking Heads, Sinatra. But being that we are in the midst of a World Series involving the New York Yankees, and they're from the Bronx, I want to talk about Mr. William Martin Joe, Billy Joe, who is from the Bronx, and ask you if you have a favorite song, a favorite album, or just a favorite memory about Billy Joe as a New Yorker.
Billy Joel.
Yes.
Well, first of all, Long Island claims him as a Long Island native, so that's what
Thanks
I
for
am.
clarifying that.
Certainly that's part of the soundtrack of my my youth. Billy Joel and New Jersey's favorite son, Bruce Springsteen.
Right.
And I would have to say, as a rather rebellious, for no apparent reason, guy that I was, I would say My Life it would be the song that resonated with me, because it was, didn't think my parents had much to offer in terms of advice or how I should be living my life. Of course, as I got older, their wisdom presented itself to me, and it coincided with when I became a parent. And it's like, well, now their lessons are starting to make more sense to me, and it wasn't just to be annoying or controlling. It was, out of concern of the very bad choices I was prone to make at that age. So,
Right.
Yeah, I would go with My Life.
Have you ever seen Billy Joel in concert? Have you ever caught him live?
I actually can't say that I have.
Yeah. He's still going. I think he's like
he had this residency at Madison Square Garden that went on forever. And it was, and I think it's the longest ever at MSG. But he still does a great concert from what I understand. But I never saw him live. But I do love his music.
Yeah, I do too. And I've seen him live a couple of times here in Miami. And two of my earliest memories of Billy Joe is I remember my brother had bought Glass Houses. I think that came out in 1980,
Yes.
Which had so many hit songs. And I used to take it from him. He was one of his favorite albums, and I used to, I was 10, 11 years old at the time, and I used to take it from him and run over to my stepsister's room to listen to she had a much better sound system than we had in our room, and I would just blast that album. And then just Piano Man is a song that whenever, in my old days when I was frequenting happy hours and in my 20s, whenever it came on, either a jukebox, the entire bar would just stop and sing. Everyone knew the words to Piano Man, and it was such a communal experience, that song. And so, yeah, I hold a special place of Billy Joel in my heart. So anyway, thank you. Thanks for joining the podcast. I really appreciate your time. I thought that was very informative. I think the audience will get a kick out of all that you had to say. I want to thank the audience for tuning in once again, and please subscribe. Scott, appreciate it.
Well, an honor to join you, Alberto. We go back a long time, and,
Yep.
and this has been a great great conversation. I always enjoy our conversations, but this one we get to share with an audience, so that's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for tuning in once again, and until next time.
All right, thanks again, Alberto.